Um, and most of you might have seen or noticed I put out this sheet of paper on the chairs, and it gives you the basic outline of the book of Malachi. And the book of Malachi, as I mentioned before, is sort of it's organized as a series of arguments or sort of God's arguments with his people. And so that's how we're going to go through it. And we're in disputation number 2, or if you will, argument number 2. As you can see, the second line, chapter 1, verse 6, versus chapter 2, verse 9. So that's what I'll be talking about or meditating on some today. But before I go into that, actually, I'm just going to do a little vignette, a preview, if you will, of getting into, once again, the time and the space of the nature of the people that the book of Malachi is talking to, and how it is relevant to this day, because I think that is something, especially with these Old Testament prophets, sometimes it's easy because of the language and because of the culture is so foreign to us, it's easy for us to get in a mindset that, well, this really has what's this mean for me today, right? It's interesting, maybe, it's historically interesting, but what's it mean for me today? And so one of the ways that I want to bring it home, as it were, or talk about how these things are relevant today, is using Bill Burr, which is probably a surprise to some of you. Bill Burr is a stand-up comic. He has some specials on Netflix, and he's on talk shows. And if you follow stand-up comics at all, you'll be very familiar with him. I do not recommend him as a follower of Jesus. He's not someone I would recommend to be listening to. He's quite vulgar, and he's not shy about expressing his atheistic views and mocking Christianity. And to top it off, he has this, in my opinion, sort of a subtext of misogyny in his humor, which is not great either. So this is not my talking about him is not any kind of commendation of him or listening to him. But there was a very interesting thing where he talked about with regard to losing his faith in this bit that he did in one of his specials, his stand-up specials. And that I'm always very interested. Stand-up comics is one of those areas in our culture and our life where people can share deep, profound, spiritual, and uncomfortable truths in a way that other people can receive, because the humor acts, of course, as it relieves the tension, the stress. And so a lot of time, one of the reasons I listen to a lot of stand-up comics is because sometimes very profound things are happening between the comic and the people they're listening to. It happens in church. It can happen in stand-up comedy. There's not many places where that level of honesty can be found, in my opinion, anyway. Anyway, so and Bill Burr is brilliant. He is a very good stand-up comic in terms of, he is hilarious. There's a reason why he's so famous. But he talks about how he lost his faith. You remember me talking about Malachi is written to a people. It's a warning, really, to people who are losing their faith, but are not necessarily aware of it. Again, they're not coming under. They're not being persecuted or being forced out of their faith, and it's a subtle thing. It's a loss of passion, a loss of focus as they lose their faith. And I want to talk about Bill Burr and this bit he does about losing his faith, because I think it relates. It reminded me of Malachi when I was listening to it. So in this bit that he does, Bill Burr talks about how he lost his faith. He says, first of all, he realized, it came to him as like an epiphany or whatever, that he just didn't enjoy going to church. He didn't like getting up early on Sunday mornings and going to church. It was for him an obligation. It was like a chore, like going shopping or paying a bill, something that you're kind of supposed to do, but was kind of unpleasant and not very enjoyable. Now, of course, when he's talking about this, there's jokes and it's much more funny. I'm just shedding that and just getting to the heart of what he's saying. And of course, that is a sign of something gone wrong. We followers of Jesus gathered together. We worship out of a combination of joy, out of obedience, out of need, the need for communion with one another and with God, for the sacraments, for communion and baptism. And those are communal experiences. And they're profound, or ought to be profound. They have weight to them. There is glory in them. But he wasn't experiencing any of the weight or the glory. He was going to church I presume, sort of as a lifeless husk, not a seed waiting to be watered and to grow, but just as with nothing in him responding. So, one, he just didn't like going. It was boring. And relatedly, two, he had heard all the stories already. He grew up in the church. His parents took him to church every Sunday, and he knew the stories, right? He knew everything. I'd heard it all before. As he said, quote, "I heard all the stories 3 or 4 times, and the dude still hasn't come back yet," referring to Jesus. This is the kind of humor he's working with here. And so this is boredom combined with a kind of spiritual impatience, which we find as well in the book of Malachi. This kind of boredom and this kind of, "Lord, what have you done for us lately?" kind of attitude. And then he goes on to say that he started thinking about other religions and how all the other faiths had the stories that they believed in. Postmodernity, we might call it, if you want to get fancy with it, but it's when people start thinking about, well, why do the people over here believe all those things? Why should I believe what I believe if the Muslims or the Buddhists or the atheists or whatever, they all have their views, what makes mine? And who can say what is true? It's all faith, right? This is what Bill Burr says. And isn't faith belief without evidence? No. No. Faith is not belief without evidence. Do not ever believe anything without evidence. But Bill Burr I wasn't there to chastise him in his special. Now, in Malachi's time, there's not that kind of postmodernity in that way, but there is something very similar, which is called polytheism. In other words, the people over past that hill had their gods, and the people over there in that valley had their gods, which is in many ways very similar to postmodernity. We might say, in our day and age, you have your truth and I have mine. They would say, you have your gods and I have mine. And sometimes they would swap gods, or they would rename each other's gods so that they would share gods. But it was, in many ways, it was very postmodern, every nation with their own gods. And this was a problem in Malachi's time too. And we get to it in particular when Malachi talks about the issue of the Jewish people not being careful with marriage. And what I mean by not being careful with marriage is that they were marrying people who believed in and worshiped other gods, creating fractured families. Because and they would get drawn into paganism or polytheism through intermarriage, as it were. And so this is similar to Bill Burr's postmodernity, if you will. And then he ends up with, and by the way, at heart, aren't all religions the same? And he says, and I quote, "The basis of every religion is the same,"